So here I am. I'm Joerg Rieger. I'm a theologian at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. I work on issues of religion and power broadly conceived, but I'm really interested in questions of economic power specifically, and questions of labor, working people, the 99%. And I'm directing a program here at Vanderbilt that's called the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice. That's the only program in the country, as far as I know, that deals with issues of religion, economics, and labor issues. We also deal with ecology. You can find us on religionandjustice.org. Just one word, religionandjustice.org. So that's the Wendland Cook Program.
Right on. Well, everybody, Joerg has been so instrumental in Chase and I's political development, and we're so lucky to have Joerg with us this evening. Let's just jump right in, just so we're not rambling around. But before we do, please run, don't walk to our Patreon if you have $1 a month or more to throw our way so we can keep this podcast coming to you. Let's jump in. So Joerg, as we understand it, much of your work has been an intervention into theology. So you're imploring theologians to take issues of class seriously, which we've learned is pretty rare. So what's at stake when theology fails to think Marxist class analysis?
That's a big question, and I want to start somewhere slightly different here because, well, two things. First of all, I'm a theologian, so I'm asking questions of theology. I think there's some real work that has to be done, when we think about God and Jesus and the church and faith and whatnot. But I'm also saying, like you just indicated, that we can only do this if we take issues of class seriously. Now, that doesn't exclude that we're also taking issues of race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on seriously. That's all related, so it's not an either or. I'm not arguing that class is the only factor, but for some strange reasons, class is the one that's usually not considered. In fact, I would argue it's not strange. It's probably a repression that's going on. So people just don't want to talk about it. That's what we see a lot. I see that in the classroom. I see that in the academy. And maybe one reason why they don't want to talk about it is, this is how you framed your question here, Chris, is they think this is Marxist. So you talk about Marxist class analysis. Oh my God, that's horrible. You shouldn't talk about Marx. Marx is old-fashioned, outdated, whatnot. That, of course, doesn't make a lot of sense because Marx is not outdated. There's, whether Marx himself is dated or not is another question. But there's people around the world who have learned something from it, who are actually building alternative economies, relationships, movements on it. That has to be taken seriously. So this is not a European phenomenon of an old white guy, but this is much broader. But there's something else I want to push here about class analysis, and this is you don't even need Marx to understand it. Think about it this way. We just come out of the pandemic. Well, not quite sure if we're out, but here's the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we learned they're essential workers. They're workers that are so important that we really need them. We could not exist without them. That's the first indication that class might actually be important, right? So working people, working class people, we couldn't live, we couldn't survive without them. Well, that's something, of course, that Marx might agree with, but you don't have to read Marx to understand it. You just have to pay attention. The other piece is if you start talking to these essential workers, people who have done this during the pandemic or keep doing it now, you will realize that something like class struggle is going on. And the person at the grocery store checkout line at the cash register knows it. They know that class exists because they know that there's pressure on their lives. They know that the boss has certain demands. They know that they get paid not enough, despite the fact that they're essential, that the benefits are cut, that their jobs are in danger. That's class struggle. And this is going on whether Karl Marx said so or not. And you don't have to read a single word of Marx to understand that there are tense relationships between the classes where some people on the receiving end, the working people, are actually under a lot of pressure. They experience this every day. They're just not allowed to talk about it because if they do, they're called Marxists. But that's the reality. And that's the sort of thing that we have to take into account. I'll talk more about what this means for theologians in a minute. But just that basic fact that there are tense class relations, that some people benefit by exploiting others, that's a fact of life. And most people know it, they just don't want to say it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. When you're describing class analysis as something that's bigger than Marx, I think of whenever I tell people I'm a Maoist and they say, "Oh, so you're like really into Mao?" I'm like, "Well, I guess, but it's actually more about a kind of analysis. It's a tradition or something of the sort." The same is true for Marxism in a sense. Like Marx is definitely important. We get the tools from Marx, and Marx's name is an interesting, placeholder, but it's not any sort of worship of Marx. And it is interesting how that perception became so popular that to be a Marxist or to be any kind of ist is to be in love with Marx. Especially, a lot of my new African comrades would say, I don't care about Marx the person. I just want the analytical tool.
Yeah,
And
Chris.
that's the point exactly. Yes, that there's people that use these analytical tools all around the world. You don't have to be a philosopher. You don't have to be anything specific. You just have to pay attention. And once you do that, I think it's very hard to say that makes no sense.
Yeah, and Chris, just to piggyback on that, I would wonder if, there's a difference between like reading Marx, reading Lenin, reading Mao, and just dogmatically throwing out some kind of random quote and saying this is why we do this, right? That's dogmatism. That's book worship, finding some kind of quote and saying this is the word, this explains the world, as opposed to understanding Marxism, or what Chris and I subscribe to as Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, as a science, right? It's a revolutionary science, and I think that's what differentiates reading an individual and kind of seeing an individual's ideas as some kind of thing to be worshipped, as opposed to thinking Marxism as a science. The science of historical materialism has taught us that the engine of human history, the base of human society, is a struggle between classes. So I think there are some things that, you can understand productive relations. You can understand that there are working people and then there are exploiters. There are, working masses and then there are capitalists without Marx, right? Marx was engaging liberal political economy, right? Capitalist economists. And they were saying very similar things about landlords, or, that boss, they acknowledged that bosses and workers existed in the same economy. But I do think, I want to hear your thoughts on this, Joerg. I do think that understanding Marxism as a science is really, really important, both for adequately understanding society and the development of history, but also most effective, being most effective at struggling to transform society. So would you say that you agree that Marxism does need to be understood as a science, or would you say no, it's not a science, and theologians don't need to or engage Marxism as a science? What do you think?
That's a pretty big question. I mean, if you think about science, and of course you could say, well, it's a natural science, is it a social science? What type of a science is it? But the basic scientific move is to look at empirical evidence, to pay attention to what's happening around you. And I think as far as that goes, even theologians need to do that. And this is an uphill battle for me in my field, because theologians usually don't want to look at empirical evidence. They look at ideas. They think there's something out there they can pull in here without really looking at what happens at the grassroots. But the science that we're talking about, and that I want to affirm actually, is, well, first of all, is looking at empirical evidence. And secondly, it's looking at evidence in places where this doesn't always happen. So economics might also describe itself as an empirical science, but it's usually looking at the top of the system. It's looking at, big financial markets, perhaps. It's looking at all kinds of other evidence. And there's an argument now, actually, by economists that says a lot of economics doesn't even look at evidence. It just functions like a bad religion, where it simply banters around big ideas that you have to believe at face value. So we're beyond that. We don't think that economics should function that way, just believing big ideas without testing them without evidence. I don't think religion should function that way. I don't think theology should function that way. So what we have in common now is to say we want to look at evidence, and we want to look, that's maybe the Marxist element here too. We want to look at where the rubber hits the road. Where is this thing actually affecting the majority of people in the world? I mean, we're not just talking, oh, there are some working people here and there. We need to realize that the majority of the world's population is actually working people, and that applies to the United States. Some estimates say 2/3 of Americans are working class. That's probably true, but more and more middle class people are also not ruling class. They kick themselves if they think they have more power than they really do. And so from that perspective, what we're talking about is we're looking at questions that can be observed empirically, that people can figure out in their own lives, where you don't even have to have a university education. I mean, the working person, whether that's any working place really, and that includes universities, by the way, as working places. The working person should be able to figure it out just by looking at how power flows and how this thing affects them in their own bodies. Maybe if I could take this a little back into the theology question that Chris raised in the beginning. Keep in mind, I'm a theologian. Why should theologians talk about this? You could start from some big concepts and say theology is all about relationship. And, I could tell you beautiful stories about relationships. There's a relationship within God's self that's called Trinity. There's a relationship between God and humanity. There's a relationship among humans. All these things matter for theology, I would say. But once you've said that, I'm arguing that you really have to pay attention to relationships of power. And so once you look at that, you look at human relationships, you see exploitation happening. You think about how does that reflect in the relationship of humanity and God? A lot of people project their human relationships to relationships with God, or into the Godhead itself. And so if the relationship question is crucial to theology, we really have to pay attention to it. And what we're finding is there's an unavoidable tension in a capitalist system. This is not talking about human nature in general. This is talking about how we structured our world, how we structured economy and politics and religion. And that we have to talk about. That's why theologians have to pay attention to it. And if they don't, I think they're missing a huge part of what's their job. So by closing your eyes, it's not going to go away. You're just going to miss it. And then all your other conclusions are going to be faulty and probably not that helpful.
Let me ask this bonus question. What kind of response do you get, if you could summarize, in the academy when you start bringing up class issues? In theology in particular, what would you say is the feedback from others in the academy?
A lot of people just shut down. I mean, right now in the theological academy especially, there's a good deal of research done into gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, which is very important, very clearly. But when you mention class in this context, people's eyes glaze over and they don't quite know what to do with it. That's one thing. Some of that has to do with people maybe just not knowing what to do with it. Some of it has to do, I think, with faulty understandings of class. So two things here. One is this class struggle thing that we're talking about, tense class relationships are seen as an outdated model from the past. I mean, even if you want to call it science, they would say, well, that's the science of the 19th century. It isn't. I mean, it's still there, and you have to take that into account, but we're not just supposed to. Then there's a lot of faulty or maybe incomplete, let me not say faulty, but at least insufficient definitions of class that a lot of people probably remember from their college days. So people who went to college probably remember something about class and stratification. And stratification means, class are like the layers of a cake. There's a lower class, a lower middle class, middle class, upper middle class, you name it. Some sociologists distinguish 15 classes. The trick there is that these classes are just like layers of a cake that are out there without relationship. So it doesn't really relate to anything. It doesn't make a difference. It's just for curious sociologists to do a little bit more science and now to describe what this class and that class looks like, talk about food choices, cultural choices, movie choices, that sort of stuff, highbrow, lowbrow. That stuff can all be studied, but it's not that relevant to what we're talking about. We're talking about fundamental relationships between people that go very deep, that go back to labor relationships. And keep in mind, 99% of us have to work for a living. So labor is actually something, the relationship of working people and their superiors in this system is part of something that has to be analyzed. So the problem then is either faulty class analysis or just ignoring the issue. And so what I regret the most is that this conversation really never even takes place. People assume, well, that's not relevant here, or they assume it's an old-fashioned way of dealing with things, or brings back some bad memories from their college days. None of this is helpful. But what I'm pushing for is that we need to have this conversation. And the good news is, I want to conclude this question with the good news, that a lot of people are waking up. Now, who's waking up is the essential workers, is even in the academy, younger academics that might not get jobs, that might feel in their own bodies what it's like to be an adjunct and to be treated probably worse than some of the cafeteria workers on campus, these adjuncts. It's not just a question of money. It's a question of how you're treated. It's a question of what power you have. And so a lot of people are experiencing this now and are waking up. And that's where I think the conversation needs to happen.
Absolutely. And if I may add, we are waging an inter-imperialist war right now with Russia in Ukraine. We just lost 18 children's lives to a mass murder. Masses of workers are being laid off. They're fed up. They're working 60, 70-hour weeks. We're getting crushed at work. We're getting crushed in our communities. Policing is being ramped up. People locked in cages, immigrants either massacred on the line or tortured in basically what you can call concentration camps. We're living still on colonized lands. And so if you're a theologian and if you don't take Marxist class analysis, if you don't take this war between classes seriously, if you don't take the material interests of ruling imperialist nations like the United States and colonizer nations and ruling bourgeoisies, and if you don't see how fundamentally antagonistic they are toward indigenous people, Black people, Latin and Asians here in the United States and across the world, working people everywhere, then you're not taking this world seriously. Joerg, earlier, you're talking about when the rubber hits the road. And I think I hear you talking about taking the material, real relationships, the real world seriously as theologians.
And once you do that, you really begin to take seriously how this little thing that we're talking about, right? Class relationships, tense class relationships, how that shapes everything else. That may be the other answer to Chris's question, what's the problem here in the academy? Why don't people not get it? Well, they probably assume if there is something like that going on, it has to do with your pocketbook, has to do with how much money you make, has to do with a little part of your life. But what we're saying is this really has to do with everything. So how you experience this fundamental relationship in your life shapes the way, you're engaging in politics. So economics and politics are related. Again, maybe people are not too surprised about that, but it shapes how you think. It shapes how you do theology. It shapes your ideas of God. It shapes your personal relationships, how you relate to your partners, how you relate to your children, how you relate to your community. All of that gets shaped here. And by not taking into account what's going on, you're really missing a major part of reality. And that's the thing that we're talking about.
Your deep solidarity has been a phrase that you've used throughout your work for the last couple of years. How is deep solidarity different from liberal, or you might call bourgeois populism? All right. A lot of folks, when we talk about the mass line, they're like, oh, that's populism. And from a Maoist perspective, we understand mass work, communist organizing as very different from populist perceptions of organizing and understanding. So So first of all, how is it different, deep solidarity, different from liberal populism? Why is solidarity really necessary? And what makes it dangerous for capitalists and imperialists?
Well, let me start with that last question. What makes solidarity dangerous? There's one way of looking at politics today that basically thinks about politics as special interest business. So, like for instance, that's one misunderstanding, I think, when you deal with the race question is to assume, racism affects a minority of the population, just a few people, or maybe, depending on how many percent of what race are affected, you could think, well, that's minority politics. Other politics are oftentimes seen that way too. I mean, even a Green New Deal, that's something for some people. When you talk solidarity, it's very clear. This is not minority politics; it's majority politics. Um, Back in the Occupy Wall Street days, as you'll remember, we were talking about the 99%. Now, that's not a precise number, and maybe it's not the most precise class analysis, but it is saying that there's 99% or at least 99% of us who are not really benefiting from this system. And if these people were waking up, realizing that the system helps them less than they're told it does, this would be really dangerous for the few that are raking in the big bucks and that are holding the big power. Keep in mind, class is always about not just money but power. So that's the thing, and that's the thing. Once people come together, that gets once the many realize we're the many and they're the few, that's a big challenge. So that's one answer also to say why solidarity is necessary. Not to say that you can't make some progress with minority politics also, but by realizing that more of us are affected by this than we usually give ourselves credit for, that's really crucial. And maybe that's one thing that is missing in liberal populism, and I don't know exactly what you have in mind, but I could give you some examples. I mean, for instance, in a lot of solidarity work done by liberals, the idea is something like I'm putting myself in solidarity with the marginalized so that I can do something good for them. It's not charity necessarily, but it could be advocacy. I'm going to speak out for those who have no voice. I mean, that's sort of one model in how liberal populism has sometimes functioned. Well-to-do people or who think they're well-to-do, putting themselves on the side of those, the marginalized, the oppressed. Those are terms that are used. I mean, we've seen this in the 80s, for instance, with a lot of solidarity with Central America. U.S. Citizens would put themselves on the side of Central Americans fighting for their liberation. That's certainly a good start. I mean, I don't want to put this down, but what's missing there is no sense that maybe we have more in common than meets the eye. So it's some well-meaning people who think they're privileged, putting themselves on the side of some people they think are underprivileged. And the problem with that, of course, is that if this is the way solidarity functions, you can always walk away, which is exactly what happened, right? A lot of these well-meaning people got burned out after a while. This happens to allies a lot too, right? You want to be an ally. That's another form of liberal populism, perhaps. You put yourself on the side of, other people and you want to center them and all of that. Well, once you get tired, you can always walk away. So the problem with this kind of solidarity is that people don't really know what holds it together. It's held together by moral commitments, by noblesse oblige, and all that sort of stuff. What I'm saying is there may be a better way to do it, and that's the whole point of deep solidarity. Once we realize there's a deeper connection here, I think we got something else. We got a different dynamic, and that's what makes solidarity interesting. Before I go there, let me maybe say a word about another form of solidarity that's equally, if not more problematic. There's always the solidarity on the right. That's the solidarity of fascism, basically produced ideologically. I mean, white supremacy is a great example of solidarity on the right, where white people are made to believe that they have so much in common that they should feel like they have more in common with the white one percenters, the white leadership, than with their, minority fellow workers. So white worker thinks they might have more in common with their white bosses, whether that's Jeff Bezos or anyone, than with their fellow black workers. That's solidarity according to the right. And so you're producing this misleading identity, this misleading solidarity that misleads a lot of people thinking, oh, we're all together in this, while in reality, that white supremacy functions best, benefits the most those who are at the top. And those who are at the bottom, well, they still have some benefits, obviously, but they're not the ones who are winning. So divide and conquer here basically means, or I talk about it as unite and conquer sometimes. You're basically creating the illusion of a solidarity, and who's ultimately winning is not you. You're conquered just as much as the others are conquered. White working people are conquered by white supremacy in some ways, and they don't realize it. Whereas, of course, black workers and many other workers, they realize that this is not in their own interest. So there's problematic forms of solidarity and populism on the left and on the right, and deep solidarity is designed to address that. I probably need to explain that some more, but I just wanted to put that basic framework out there first.
No, yeah, there's some really good stuff there. I think from a historical materialist perspective, something that's really important is understanding the revolutionary, what we might call the revolutionary class line. And so that helps us understand, with Marxist, Leninist, Maoist analysis, we can understand how classes are actually in relationship, right? What we call historical materialism. But then we can also help understand, okay, what classes or what parts of the class are going to be our allies or perhaps our enemies. And so I think the revolutionary class line really helps us develop these struggles that are most in line with helping us end colonialism, right? End U.S. settler colonialism, or end the bourgeois exploitation of the masses of workers here in the United States, or end imperialism. And what populism does alternatively is it says, forget class, or maybe class is a part of it, but we kind of have all these different things and they're all like in a hodgepodge together. And so you end up making allies with different like white people who don't really have, there are so-called patriotic socialists, right? And so they fail to understand that America must be destroyed, right? That we're a U.S. settler colonial colony. We're the imperialist power of the world. From a Maoist perspective, being patriotic is basically collaborating with the colonizing class, the colonizing nation, trying to preserve the colonizer without understanding that, no, who we have most in common with, I as a white settler, but also working class, who I have most in common with is the nationally colonized indigenous and Black and Latino and Asian people. So I think that's one of the big differences is liberal populism can say, listen, we're kind of all in this together. If you're like vaguely for reform, we've had struggles in the past here in North Carolina where they're called fusion politics. At the end of the 20th century, you had Black workers and white workers, but you also had other people's of different positions in our class society that they ended up making wrong alliance. They made alliances with white supremacists, and that actually crushed their working class movement. And so yeah, I think the big difference to me is revolutionary class line differentiates itself from liberal populism in that A, it subscribes to historical materialism, and B, it is way more effective at correctly naming, okay, who is really our enemy and who is really our ally in this struggle to end colonialism, capitalism, imperialism. Liberal populism, last thing I'll say, it might not actually want to end it. It might struggle to reform the system. We just want to make America a nicer, safer place for everyone equally, without understanding that we're colonizers here. At least I myself am as a settler, and that there is no peace between capitalists and the working masses. There is no peace as long as there is patriarchy.
I mean, the problem too is, for liberals, it's very hard to think about enemies because we're supposed to be friends. Why can't we all get along, right? That's a typical liberal question. The reality is there is some strife, there are some tensions. That's what we talked about earlier. There is some exploitation going on, and that just has to be uncovered. Not because you feel bad about enemies and you shouldn't have or should not have them, but because this is a way of life that's not life-giving, and that's quite harmful, and that has to be overcome. I sometimes, since you're talking about socialism here also, I sometimes ask my students, what's the opposite of socialism? And there's all kinds of answers here, but in terms of my own German background, I'm actually arguing the opposite of socialism is National Socialism. Uh, which is this national selfishness, where the idea is, we want to be socialists, but with a limited range of people, right? This is a nationalist thing, and that turns socialism always into its opposite. So you need an international component. You need to realize there is some international affinity among those who are not benefiting, who are being exploited by the system. Now, this is an ancient idea. I mean, I sometimes tongue-in-cheek say St. Paul knew about this when he talked about the church as the body of Christ and said, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And so if you look around at who is suffering and you begin to realize that their suffering actually affects you, um, maybe not in the same way necessarily, but you're not independent of that. Individualism is a lie. It's the lie of capitalism. Their suffering affects your suffering. That's something I think that people can grasp, and whatever the socialist ideology is that you want to use, if you just take this to union organizing, the unions say an injury to one is an injury to all. It's a similar idea that I think is not that hard to understand once you get through it. It's just those are not the common sense ideas that people encounter anywhere. It's not what you're taught in kindergarten or in high school or in college for that matter. And so by reclaiming some of this, I think we could really get ahead of the game and realize that goes back to solidarity. Deep solidarity recognizes precisely this. An injury to one is an injury to all. One suffers, all suffer together with it. And it does not require sameness. It does not require the right-wing identity thing, where we all march in lockstep now and do the same thing. It simply requires an understanding that we're threatened by the same forces, and that, of course, coming together, celebrating diversity, putting to work our diversity, whatever you want to call this, is not optional anymore. This is the way forward. And so deep solidarity doesn't require, any sort of identity politics necessarily. Doesn't require any sort of looking alike, talking alike, follow me sort of attitude, and it certainly doesn't require any sort of individual savior figures that tell you have to be in solidarity with them. It's just people realizing their own enlightened self-interest, as it were. Of course, for theologians, the question is, where do you find God? The typical assumption is God is with the top, the powers that be. The assumption of deep solidarity is, well, what if we find God in the midst of this resistance movement that's building among the many rather than the few?
And Jorg, if I may, a question that popped in my mind along this deep solidarity is that here in the US, I think the Democratic Party tends to project itself as the party of the people, right? The party of the worker. We've all heard Joe Biden just ramble on, pretend that he actually give two shits about real working people, right? The masses of working people in the United States, let alone people across the world. The Democratic Party projects itself as the party for Black people, the party for trans people, and women and LGBTQ people. But I mean, any socialist, any genuine communist out there knows that this is a farce. So, well, like, what are your thoughts on the Democratic Party projecting itself as the party of deep solidarity? They've never used that language, but My fear, liberal populism, I think what it does is it blinds us from the real class relations. And so we can end up siding with capitalists, thinking that we're fighting the struggle against the right, when really, and that class doesn't matter. Capitalism isn't the problem. It's just like the bad apples on the right, evangelicals, they're pathological. So, we can create the myth and misunderstand that the enemies aren't just, say, evangelicalism, the ideology. The enemies aren't just super, super racist, like white supremacist fascists. But you need this class analysis to understand who the real enemies and allies should be made with. So, yeah, what do you think? Do you think the Democratic Party is really serving to promote what you are calling deep solidarity? Or do you think it is supporting people who are enemies of creating this deep solidarity?
And once you talk about enemies, I would prefer not so much to talk about people and individuals, but really to talk about structures, because ultimately, who embodies this? I mentioned Jeff Bezos earlier. Well, that's just a stand-in for an overall structure. If one of them is gone tomorrow, somebody else will take that role. So that has to be kept in mind too. The question is, who is enabling the system? And I think what we're seeing, of course, is it is very much enabled these days by the right, not only the political right, but also the religious right, who has at this point, I think, almost declared capitalism as divine and eternal. People have an easier time thinking about the end of the world than they have about thinking about the end of capitalism. I've said this many times. I've heard this as a grad student from one of my teachers, Frederick Jameson, and I think that's still the case. Your question about the Democrats here, I mean, I must say, having a party that's a little bit more responsive to the broader population is certainly helpful. But there is something that's decisive that's missing, and that's not simply a matter of concern for people, but it's a matter of concern for the agency of people. And there's a difference here. It's one thing to be concerned about the well-being of people, and I think this is really crucial. I mean, whether that's about healthcare, benefits, social networks, social security, all of that is really important. And I think you have some of this still going in the American Democratic Party. You find it in some of the social democratic tendencies in Europe, which is all great. It's better to have this than not to have it. But what's almost forgotten now is that we're not just talking about taking care of people, we're actually talking about people's agency. So if you care about working people, if you care about minorities, the question is not just how can we help them, but what role are they playing in a democratic society? What role are they playing, in our everyday relationships? For religious people, what role are, those folks playing in our religious communities? Who is actually calling the shots? Who is being listened to, and so on? That is the big question. I think that's what's missing. And unless you reclaim that, I think you're just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, as it were. You're basically perpetuating the system. You're enabling the way it's functioning. Some of it maybe with a friendlier face than others, but we're still stuck, I would say, in a situation where the few are still benefiting at the expense of the many. And that doesn't have to be. I mean, that's what we're saying. This is not natural. This is not the way the world always has been. And it's not the way the world always will be.
In your original answer, the thing that stood out to me the most was when you talked about white supremacy as a kind of solidarity. Mind blown. And it's effective. It's incredibly effective. And our liberal populism is not. The response that, most activists among us are taking is no match for any kind of solidarity because it doesn't pose any sort of meaningful alternative. Thanks for that. I'm going to use that.
Yes, I mean, I'm glad that really resonated with you, Chris, because I think that is such a crucial point. It's also one of the main points in this new book of mine that will be released in August. Theology in the Capitalocene is its title, and the subtitle is Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. And I have a couple of nice things to say about identity. So those who work along the lines of identity politics, I'm not dismissing it altogether, but I'm really saying we have to become aware more of, relationships, solidarity that's built in a much deeper way than just this superficial thing that we've been talking about, or the misleading thing, which is even worse. There's misleading forms of solidarity that do more harm than good to most of us.
Well, okay, you brought up the new book, not me. So I'm going to ask you a question that begins with a quote from the introduction to the new book.
Okay.
And it says, "Rebellion is not revolution, nor does it always lead to transformation." That's from the introduction of the new book. So what's the difference then between rebellion and revolution? I think we can agree that we in the United States have seen quite a bit of rebellion lately, but not so much revolution. So what steps does it take to get the masses from rebellion to revolution?
I think the biggest thing is we need to understand what we're up against. That takes us back to this conflictual relationship we were talking in the beginning. We need to understand that what we're up against here is going very deep. It's systemic. I mean, a lot of people talk about systemic things. A lot of people talk about systemic racism, which is a huge problem in this country. But when they say systemic, they're not always quite clear what the system is. So without looking at the system, no revolution can happen because you don't know what you need to overturn, right? Which is, of course, also why we have so much rebellion. People realize that something is not right. I mean, if you're not rebelling at this point, whether this is against these ongoing mass shootings, whether this is against, an economic policy that benefits less and less people at the expense of more and more people. If you're not rebelling against what we're seeing with climate change, if you're not rebelling about racism, the carceral system, sexism, the mistreatment of minorities, something is wrong. The problem is that a lot of these things are much more connected than we realize. And unless we realize how they are connected and how they're used really to hold people in place, no revolution can happen. I heard Richard Wolff say recently in one of his shows, he was talking about this old adage, speaking truth to power. And he said, if you're speaking truth to power, it's possible that you have the truth, but they still have the power. So even if your rebellion is pointing to certain truth, so I'm not trying to put down rebellion here. I'm not trying to say, rebellion is sort of not helpful at all, but it sort of points maybe towards the truth. But it is not oftentimes building about power. I see this, for instance, with a lot of protest movements that are built on this premise that you have to protest something. And if you protest enough, somebody will listen to you and give you what you want, what you're protesting for. Well, sometimes that happens in politics. Things are possible. But the question that's not asked here is, how do we build the power that actually makes protest effective? Now, if you take this back into the world of the unions, I think the unions are a lot more realistic. They're not just protesting. They have certain goals. They have a body of people that are collaborating and working together. They have certain strategies. That's already going beyond the rebellion picture. But that's what I think is missing, especially among a lot of white-meaning liberals who are right now outraged for a lot of good reasons, but who are somehow assuming that all they need to do is, tell the system what's wrong, or make accusations, or, have a couple of moral appeals to people of goodwill. None of that, as far as I can tell, really goes to the core of the system. So when I say revolution, what I mean is an approach that goes to the core of the system, and that requires power analysis. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? That also requires something that I'm addressing in the book, and this is a distinction of privilege and power. I think this is another problem, right? A lot of people nowadays recognize that they have some privilege. And I mean, since we talked about white supremacy, we need to talk about white privilege. We need to talk about male privilege, talk about heterosexual privilege. Those are all privileges that I have, some of those you have also. And those are important to recognize. But simply rebelling against the privileges is not enough if you don't always also analyze the relationship of power. So here's the paradox: you can have a lot of privilege, but chances are you don't have a lot of power. I mean, I could use myself as an example. So I have a name chair professorship at a major university. I am doing fairly well for myself. Thank you very much. But my power to change the world is strangely limited. I mean, I'm supposed to believe that if I get up on a soapbox somewhere, maybe in a lecture hall with a couple of thousand people or on a webinar, if I speak truth to power, things will change. Well, I've done this enough to tell you they won't. And using your privilege in this way, thinking that all you need to do is speak up, this is a mistake that we made when we talked to our parents and grandparents in Germany. Why didn't you speak up against fascism? Well, that's a good question, but we assumed if they had spoken up against fascism, it would have ended because somebody would have listened to them. They realized that probably wasn't the case. So here's the question. If you have a lot of privilege, but you realize your power is limited, what do you do? Well, you need to organize. You need to build some power. And the way you organize and you build power is the question of solidarity. It goes back to deep solidarity. You need to realize that ultimately your power is tied to the power of the 99%, not to the 1%. And once you start organize in that direction, you can actually maybe change something. That's the difference between revolution and rebellion. And once you then start organizing, you will find ways of dealing with your privilege. In fact, you will find ways of deconstructing your privilege. I mean, very seriously, for me, as a white Germanic type, grew up in Germany, spent the first half of my life there. One way to deconstruct my privilege is to put myself on the side of people who are struggling, to be part of that struggle consistently. And sooner or later, I cannot go home again. And if you don't believe me, talk to my former teachers, talk to my old peers, who will not let me back in because I still have white privilege, but it doesn't count in those circles, right? I still have male privilege, but by putting myself on the side of women and feminist theologians, my male colleagues get a little suspicious, So it's those kinds of things that I'm talking about. That's the difference between rebellion and revolution in so many words.
And you mentioned fascism. I just want to throw out that fascism was destroyed, or it was combated. It was defeated temporarily through armed struggle, right? Communist peasants and workers in Soviet Russia made a great sacrifice, and they defeated both German and Japanese fascism. So I do want to throw that out, that even the most non-violent, if you lay down in front of a tank, guess what? They were going to run over your body. So to defeat fascism with the Second World War, how was that defeated? That was through armed struggle. But also, you mentioned about, I think you said something about like tweeting or no, speaking truth to power. I think, unfortunately, in a lot of seminaries, we're taught that, wow, the sermon is the means of transforming the world. Or personally, at least I grew up with that. I grew up evangelical, but all throughout my experience in seminary too, I really, really did believe that sermon was really like extra important and really powerful. But I think that also has been translated into the Twitter, Instagram, TikTok world where people want to be influencers. We want to have a platform. And if we think we tweet the right things, if we share the right stories, if we make the right videos, if we record the right podcasts, then we can influence the world to a whole new world. But that is completely wrong. That's not even rebellion. Rebellion is mass eruption, right? And oftentimes violent against property, but also resistance against police and fascists right now in the US. But rebellion is unorganized. And I think one of the key differences between rebellion and revolution is that revolution is organized. It's led. And as Maoists, as revolutionary communists, we think revolution should be put upon a scientific basis. If folks are listening and they're interested in kind of moving from that support of rebellion to that support of revolution, I have a new podcast called Mass Struggle, where we're talking about revolutionary theory for the purposes of revolutionary practice. We've also talked about Marxism, Leninism, Maoism on this pod before, but that's a new podcast that is solely kind of for revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice. But okay, last thing I want to say is, if folks are listening and they're like, "Wow, that seems pretty far out," what I think the best thing that folks can start doing right now is organizing and educating for the necessity of socialism, right? For the necessity of establishing a real people's democracy, the necessity of ending imperialism, and particularly U.S. imperialism. And how do we do that as Maoists? We use the mass line. That's how we kind of come to our correct ideas, correct methods, and tactics. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that rebellion is unorganized, revolution is organized and led. We need that kind of leadership to actually win a real protracted people's war, which in 2 days, our next episode is actually releasing with a Magnificast. And we're talking about Christian Maoists in the Philippines. So you might find that interesting. Moving on, just to keep that, be aware of our time. So in a recent interview with Richard Wolff, you mentioned Wolff earlier, you said, quote, "Socialism is as American as apple pie," end quote. So I was curious, what do you mean by this? And can the United States of America exist alongside the freedom of colonized peoples of the world?
So you've been talking about, science and scientific evidence a lot, and I mean I agree. We have to look at evidence. We have to look at, what's happening around us. There's some empirical awareness that's helpful. But you also have to look at history. So we're not just looking at what's happening now. We're looking at what has been going on. What is the history of the U.S. And what strikes me, another thing that has been repressed in looking at U.S. history is that there have been powerful socialist movements in the United States in various forms and fashions and in various places. I used to teach in Dallas for 22 years at SMU. And there I realized at some point, came across it in a history book, that there were very strong movements of religious socialists in northeast Texas, southeastern Oklahoma. They had camp meetings in the summers, like a lot of the evangelicals did, that brought together 10,000 people, socialists in Texas and Oklahoma. There were farmers, a lot of them, they were working people. That's part of our history that's just been repressed. We had all kinds of interesting phenomena called sewer socialisms, where socialism basically was built on, infrastructure, stuff that makes up civilizations, like literally sewers, electricity, water lines, that sort of stuff. That got a lot of mayors elected on socialist platforms in the United States. Well, not in recent times, but in the past, and that should not be overlooked. We now have some resurgent socialist moves. People think like the DSA, Democratic Socialists, and all of that. These things sort of came out of people reading books, but there's longer ongoing traditions. The social gospel we're beginning to realize again was very much influenced not just by liberal do-gooders. That's sort of the story on the street now. Oh, the social gospelers were just liberals, who wanted to help poor people. That is not really true either. There's a lot of streams in the social gospel, including a Black African American social gospel that has socialist roots. So that's one thing I mean to say. There is an American tradition, or traditions in plural. Not all of them I would necessarily agree with, but that are built into the DNA of this country, and not just because immigrants brought this with them from Europe. I mean, African Americans picked it up, others picked it up. Other immigrants picked it up, people from various backgrounds and traditions picked it up. So that is one thing. The other thing here is to say we really need to think about the U.S. here, not so much as a nation. I mean, I'm not saying this is about the United States of America. I'm saying this is about socialist streams coming together, and of course, you have them from various parts of the world. There's socialist streams coming from Latin America as well. Coming from the East, China, and so on. These things, put them all together, and you'll have to say there's something very American about that. That has to do with what people might even think is an American way of life. And by the way, if the American way of life is working people actually having some freedom in amounting to anything, that to me is socialism too. This is just not capitalism. Capitalism is not anybody can be a millionaire. Well, maybe anybody can be a millionaire, but this will only always be the few. Socialism is saying, anybody can work hard and maybe do something with their lives. That's a very different story. But that's also American. So that's just a couple of ideas here. What I do not mean, let me make this also very clear. What I do not mean to say is that the United States of America, as it is today, is somehow an embodiment of this. In fact, I think there have been all kinds of efforts, some more prominent, some less prominent, to erase this history, to do away with it. And that's tied with the colonization efforts. So colonization here is not just external, U.S. as a colonizing force for other countries, but it's also internal. And in sort of doing this colonizing work, of course, everything got lost. And so in this sense, I agree. The U.S. as it is cannot exist as it is and go on and just claim sort of, maybe a more benign social system. We have to ask these bigger questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely think it does. What I was hearing from you was that the revolutionary movement will take on a particular character. Let's say, for example, from colonized indigenous folk or new African folk, which is different from saying that it's some sort of universal socialist movement. And if that's what you're saying, I think that's true. And that clarification at the end was also helpful, that the USA, as it currently exists, cannot coexist with socialist society. And what will that transformation look like, and what will be on the other side? I think we might have possibly a little bit different answers on that between us. But I think the most true answer is I don't exactly know. But I know that the imperial machine that has been this country from its inception cannot coexist with communist society. And from what I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like you really disagree with that.
Exactly. So that's not a way of trying to rescue either certain nation states. I also have no interest in, there's a lot of talk about Europe these days and how Europe is more enlightened and all of that. I mean, it is, I grew up there. I know what it feels like to have free healthcare and dental care, to go to university for free. And if your parents can't pay your rent, the government will pay your rent, let alone, I mean, tuition is not even an issue in Germany, for instance. That's all a lot more enlightened. But to say, therefore, Europe is the model forward is not the point either. The point here is working people collaborating, working together for their own interests, which are ultimately not just their own interests, but this is the interest of the 99%. This is the interest of the environment, as far as I can see. This is the interest of the planet, because it is a way of addressing any sort of kind of imperialism, and religion is oftentimes part of that. That's one reason I'm working on this work as a theologian. Without being clear about the imperial temptations, I think we're not going to move forward here. So raising the question the way you did it, I think, is important, but also realizing there are some things happening in the United States. I mean, I hear you mention the names of Marx, Lenin, and Mao a lot. There's some real wisdom here. There's also contradictions among these thinkers, so don't move them together too closely. But there's more than that. There's a whole stream of traditions where I think, especially if you're interested in these socialist traditions, we'd have to have a lot more conversations where we learn from each other, where we learn from non-US traditions, where we learn from non-white traditions, especially where the indigenous traditions not only need to have a voice, but really could make tremendous difference in all of what we're doing. So that's what's coming together. And of course, that goes back to this notion of deep solidarity, why I think it's absolutely necessary.
And speaking of indigenous folk, I mean, some lands need to go back to indigenous people, which undermines, I think, the entire American project. Specifically, I think about Hawaiian indigenous folk who are calling for America to end their colonization of the the several islands of Hawaii. But it's not just Native Hawaiians; it's people all across Turtle Island of Canada and the United States who are calling for the end of colonization, which isn't just okay. Now let's like pay reparations or let's be nice to indigenous people. Let's like give them a seat in Congress. No, what they want is the end of American presence. And so what they will build after decolonization is something that we might be allowed to be a part of, that we'll participate in. But I do think, to be clear, decolonization assumes actual land back. And that's something I don't think America is actually going to ever be willing to do. And personally, as a white settler, I'm a working class white settler. I don't think working class white settlers have anything to benefit from the persistence of this country. My grandma, I've said it several times before, but she spent a long time of her life super fucking poor. She heated her house with her oven. She lost her husband. Her husband and my grandpa was a teacher for a while, but then got ousted from the education place that he was at and was sent to a factory and was miserable. He hated his job. So I think working class white settlers in rural United States, but also in urban areas, I think we have more in common with the formerly and presently enslaved Black people, whether and colonized indigenous people and Latin and Asians, to end the existence of America. I think we can build something that actually serves the masses of working people, that isn't colonizing people, that isn't exploiting our labor, our family's labor, our neighbor's labor, and isn't trying to crush the masses across the world. So I guess personally, I wanted to say that America has to die. We have to build something after America. And I think white settlers, working class white settlers in particular, we have more solidarity. We have more common interests with Black workers and Latin workers and Asian and indigenous peoples, and even the whole decolonizing project than we do with, say, Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, right? Mark Zuckerberg's white. He's a white male. I have nothing in common with that person. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I think it's really important for working class white people, or if you're a pastor or you're a seminarian, and if you speak, if you preach, if you teach to working white people, I think we really have to reconsider, okay, do working white people, settlers, do we have more in common with petty bourgeois and bourgeois white people, or do we have common with the project to end colonialism and end capitalism? And we can't have a country that, a new world that has imperialism. So I wanted to throw that out there before
Right.
Go ahead.
I mean, this is the reason for talking about the difference of privilege and power. I mean, if you walk into a store and Zuckerberg walks into a store, and they look at you as two white guys, there's some similarities there, right? They will not do what they would do, or if you get stopped, depending on what car you drive, right, by the police, you'll have a different experience. Deep solidarity is the point of saying we really have to think about these different privileges. So it's not to say ultimately, we have to erase difference. In fact, it's thinking about it, but also thinking about what you were just saying in terms of the differentials of power. And there, the differential between you and Zuckerberg is basically infinite. I mean, I talk about this sometimes as, using theological language as an ontological difference. I mean, you're both human beings, but in terms of power, in terms of influence, in terms of what all that means, for the way you can influence the world and somebody else in that position can influence the world, there's no comparison. But this is very hard for people to understand. I mean, I find this in university contexts often where faculty, for instance, assume they have more in common with the university leadership than with the adjuncts. Whereas if you just look at salary numbers, and an adjunct makes 20,000 and a president of a university makes a couple of million, well, guess where you find the faculty closer to whom? And that's just a simple mathematical example that doesn't look at the question of power. But this is why power is so important, because otherwise you will not really understand where you're needed, and where you might be able to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking this is a tangent we can't really afford to go off on right now, but I'm thinking about the recent mass shootings that have taken place and the theory of replacement, of Chase, connecting to what you said about ending the relationship of colonization and what that would mean to give land back, and the kind of solidarity that poor and working white people have with wealthier white people, to the point where they're actually worried about their own asses whenever a change of power occurs. That's telling. I think that's testament to the deep solidarity that already exists in white supremacy that we've already talked about. But for now, I think we should move on. So we've already brought up reparations, and you talk about this a lot in your book, Joerg. So if you're interested in reparations, please go out and pick that up when it's available. So it's no secret. Leftists, socialists, communists, generally, there are some differences of opinion, but most of us are for reparations. But we disagree perhaps on what needs to happen for reparations to be realized. So, Joerg, what are your thoughts on that?
So in the book, the final chapter is on reparations, because I think this sums up a lot of what we're talking about. And of course, I talk specifically about reparations for slavery in the United States. There's other conversations that should also be had. So not to say this is the only one, but to use this as one of the prominent examples. And, if you talk about this from a political perspective, that's one thing. You can also talk about this from a religious perspective. And I think it's pretty clear, no matter what your religious traditions are, that, if you do something wrong, it's not just forgive and forget. Something has to happen to make things right. Again, there's all kinds of ideas of salvation that are about making things right again. And we started talking about relationships in the beginning. Let me bring this back to relationships again. If you think about what has to be repaired, of course, you have to think about what has been destroyed. And I'm arguing that what has been fundamentally destroyed here is a relationship. Now, if you think about slavery specifically, you could say a fundamental distortion in that relationship is an absolutely distorted labor relationship. I mean, if labor relationships, the way they shape up in capitalism, amount oftentimes to the exploitation of working people, the exploitation of slaves is absolute. It's not just the exploitation of labor, but it's the exploitation of, everything, your whole being, your mind, your body, anything you can imagine here is subject to control by the master. And so if that's the distortion of slavery, my argument is, if you want to think about reparations, think about how that can be repaired. So what I'm suggesting then is to say, if you thought about reparations for slavery as reparations in the labor relationship, and to begin with African Americans who are still bearing this burden. This is not something that was just in the past. This shapes people's lives and shapes communities' lives to this very day. If you think about, you reconstruct labor relationships that are non-exploitative or less exploitative, you could really see how this could help people flourish, how it could help them overcome some of these past burdens. And it would, of course, also mean, for the perpetrators to maybe pocket some losses, because once you change labor relationships, some people gain, and other people will not gain quite as much anymore if your surplus comes from the surplus that comes from your workers, right? If your surplus comes really from what other people produce and you expropriate. So in this sense, I think it's not that hard to see that a relationship that gets restored here would be very appropriate when you talk about reparations. Now, what this would take, of course, is not just a nice idea and somebody preaching it from a lot of pulpits, but it would mean that working people actually have to build some power. That those who are affected by this distorted relationship would band together in solidarity and change some of these relationships. Now, the beauty here is that if you start somewhere, restoring labor relationships, it doesn't just stop there. It's not just, oh, this is just for them. Once labor relationships take on a different character, this will affect other people. I mean, obviously, people would be really worried about this, but ultimately, those who benefit from it are a lot more people than those who would actually have to pay in, have to be part of, helping to make reparations happen. So that's the basic idea of that chapter. By contrast, let me mention, since this is my own background, the German reparations to Israel for the Holocaust. And this is something, again, I grew up with, I think is absolutely necessary. So its question is not, should Germany be responsible and pay reparations? The more interesting question for me is, how does it happen? How do reparations get made? And unfortunately, what happened with German reparations to Israel, because basically there were payments from the top to the top, right, at the highest level. What happened is that Israel now, together with the United States, is, I think we are the two most unequal developed countries in the world, U.S. and Israel. And so German reparations, while they were addressing a real problem, weren't handled as well as they could have been, because they were basically just paid by the top players to the other top players, and therefore created more and more inequality. That's something that's certainly not helpful. And I think there are some really misleading ways Americans oftentimes think about reparations in that vein, especially when you ignore that what has to be repaired has to go back to labor relationships in some form or fashion, and therefore has to go back to the class conversation that we started out this conversation with.
That's interesting. So I just want to clarify, and I think this will be helpful for all of us, because you're sort of saying that reparations perhaps are not something that come from on high. They're not based on the goodwill of anybody, right? Do you think that's a fair characterization of what you're saying?
Yes, and I mean, in some ways, there's examples where this has happened, where they came from on high, and I still would say it's better than nothing. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying if it comes from on high, it's usually completely worthless, but it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I think this is what we have to be worried about, that if you put all this effort into fighting for reparations, and then in the end, all it does is basically make the system worse, so that a couple of people benefit and the masses still don't benefit. I think you're basically shooting yourself in the foot.
And earlier, Jorg, I heard you kind of suggesting that basically like worker cooperatives, right? Let's do worker cooperatives instead of, say, private property or commodities in form of private home ownership or just cash checks. Why? Because as Marxists, we know that all of that property, that cash, those homes will end up back in the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists, right? That's the process of capitalism. So I hear you kind of suggesting earlier on that you were saying, well, let's do worker cooperatives as a means of reparations as opposed to capitalist enterprises, these individual corporations. But you also talk about building power. And I do want to push a little bit and get a little bit of clarification, because you are literally one of the few theologians in the United States who has studied a lot of Marxism and use a lot of Marxism for your all of the work that you do. So I want to push a little bit. You said the word building power. Do you mean like Black people can build power in this system, like with the Democratic Party or, with the DSA, and build enough power basically to vote people into power where they can like fund worker cooperatives for Black people? Or do you think Black people and Indigenous people and Latine and the masses of even white settlers need to at some point need to seize that kind of power because no one's going to give it to us? Because I think there's a difference between this language of building power um, to support like a government that will pay for reparations, or at some point the masses of people have to take that kind of political power through force and then make those reparations possible. Where do you fall on those two lines?
Yeah, another good and big question. I mean, there's something here that we haven't quite talked about, and I think that's really important here too, because I think that may be an American thing here with that when we talk about power, we oftentimes think really mostly and foremost about political power, whether that's the voting booth or government or the state or something like that. Well, that's certainly something that matters. That's very important. A lot of people confuse socialism with this sort of power. They think socialism is basically, the Democratic Socialist Party or something like that, that works sort of in the political field. All important things, don't get me wrong. But what I'm talking about in terms of building power is something that really goes more towards economic relationships. So we talk about political democracy a lot. What if we talked about economic democracy? In other words, worker cooperatives then are not just ways of bringing workers together to have better experience at work, but they are ways of building fundamental power that bleed over into the question of political power. And as somebody studying theology and religion, I would say that also bleeds over in building religious and cultural power. This is why for the Wendling program at Vanderbilt, we're working very closely with worker co-ops, not just because we think this is a great economic model, but this, it seems to me, is a fundamental way of building power without which you cannot build power in the polls, without which you cannot even do what you're suggesting, namely taking over power from the state or from the government. You will never have enough guns, enough airplanes or tanks or anything to take power over from the kinds of governments we're seeing today. So for me, what I'm saying here is we really have to build this power as working people, having to do with cooperative businesses is one way. Building worker powers, maybe in the plural here, via unions, via working class movements and so on. It's this economic power, in other words, I think without which we cannot do anything. And of course, without which rebellion cannot be turned into revolution either. I think that's really crucial topic that a lot of American socialists, I think especially, are having a hard time seeing.
Well, Joerg, this has been an awesome conversation. We've put you through the ringer, and we've asked some pretty hard questions. And so I just want to upfront say I really appreciate the work that you've done. You've had a massive influence personally on my life, and Chris had mentioned that. I don't know if it was at the beginning of this conversation when we were recording or if it was before we were recording, but we both are deeply appreciative of what you've done and how you have influenced our political and theological journey. So again, thank you so much. Chris, did you have anything else to add before we wrap up this conversation?
I better not bring up any more points. We're at an hour and a half. But Joerg, it's been really great talking with you. Appreciate your witness and the theological work you're doing, and we wouldn't be here without it. So thank you.
And
Joerg, do you want to take a
Yes.
Yeah, did you want to take this moment and spotlight any of your program or your upcoming book again?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, let me wrap it up by thanking you because I really appreciate the questions and also some of the push behind the questions. I'm really glad you're thinking that way. You're asking these questions. I wish some of my students were asking some of these questions once in a while also, but I think you could be a good influence there. I also think we need to have more of these conversations because there's so much to be talked about. I mean, there's so much yet that we didn't even touch on. This is where the book might actually be helpful: theology in the capitalist scene, ecology, identity, class, and solidarity. We haven't talked about ecology at all, but that's another factor, and not just as a problem, but maybe also as a potential for building this power, because there's some power building that may not be even human. So that's yet another factor, and how some of this could be harnessed, I think, could be a fascinating question. I want to make it clear to people that ultimately what's going on here is something that's bigger than any of us. It's even bigger than sort of any of our ideas or ideologies. You could say that's the theological point. Some people call this God. Some people might call it, whatever history is doing. But it's certainly not based on just individuals, pushing themselves really hard so that they burn out, or moral appeals. You must do this, you must do that. I think what this is based on is actually us paying attention, on the one hand, to the forces of oppression, which we're doing more and more. And I think the two of you are doing a really good job of that. And then also paying attention to the forces of liberation that are also emerging. This is what I mean. It's bigger than us. There's things moving in the right direction that we're sometimes also missing because we're not paying attention. So looking for where things are changing, becoming part of this, availing yourself to, the bigger moves that are happening here, I think could also be very helpful. And that can happen from very different perspectives. That's the point of deep solidarity. I'm entering into this as a Christian theologian who thinks that Christianity still can make a difference. And that's not just an idea that's based on some evidence. Others may come from very different perspectives, and that's fine too. Other religious perspectives are necessary. Other political conversations are necessary. I think all of that has to come together also. But it has to be done in this broader conversation. What are we up against? Theologically, that's the question of sin and evil. And then, of course, the happy question is, where is salvation coming from? And I'm actually optimistic. People think maybe I'm too optimistic, but we're not left in the dark here, and there are some good things happening. And I think you guys are part of it, which is great. So thanks.